Let's linger there for 1 second because that's genuinely mysterious to me that the decimation of Christians and the ethnic cleansing of Christians throughout the Muslim world, how is that not a bigger story among Christians in the West?
I think certainly among evangelical communities, it absolutely is. It absolutely is.
It just never shows up in the New York Times or any real mainstream paper.
I will say that Emma Green, who's a really fair and excellent reporter, did a long story about it recently in The Atlantic for people that are curious. It was moving. So you have to have sort of such a parochial view of the world to outsource our domestic political realities on conflicts and places thousands of miles away. And yet that seems to me exactly what happens. People talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as if it's akin to something like American racism, in which Palestinians are Black Americans and Israelis are white Americans. It's just There's no relationship to reality at all.
Yeah, and it's an apartheid state. Here's the moral asymmetry that for me cuts through all the leftist and Islamist bullshit about Israel and the Palestinians and about Jews and the Muslim world generally. It's a simple question. You just have to ask yourself, what would each side do if it had the power to do whatever it wants, right? And we know what Israel would do because it does have the power to do more or less whatever it wants. It certainly has the power to kill everyone in Gaza and the West Bank tomorrow. This is something they could do any day they decided to do it. And rather than do that, what we see is that Israel takes significant pains not to kill civilians when it responds to Hamas's rocket attacks. And of course, it winds up killing civilians because Hamas uses its population as human shields, right? And, in any war, there are going to be civilians killed. But that's clearly not what the Israeli Defense Forces are intending to do. And we know that Israel pays just an extraordinary price in world condemnation when they do wind up killing kids and other non-combatants. And we also know this price is disproportionate to that paid by any other country in the same circumstances. I mean, the U.S. doesn't pay a similar price, nor do any of our allies. And conversely, we know that Hamas targets civilians. And even more important than that, we know that the discourse about Jews in the Muslim world and in the Hadith for the last 1,000 years is explicitly genocidal, right? I mean, the charter of Hamas is explicitly genocidal. And we've already had a Holocaust. We've already had several other genocides in the 20th century. So we know that people are capable of trying to exterminate a whole race of men, women, and children. We know that genocide is a thing. And we know that they're capable of doing it even when they have to make major and seemingly irrational sacrifices to do it, and when it really doesn't serve their interests, as it didn't serve the interests of the Third Reich. I mean, it made no sense for the Third Reich to waste that much energy trying to kill every last Jew in Europe when they were fighting a multi-front war. And so when people literally tell us ad nauseum, and more importantly, when they tell themselves ad nauseum, when they think no one is listening, that they intend to murder a whole people, we should believe them, right? I mean, it's insane not to believe them.
Yes, this is the thing that I think about all the time, which is either ideas matter and we believe people when they tell us who they are and what they want, or they don't. But some people want to tell me or want to tell us that when a white supremacist says he wants to kill Hispanics and Muslims and immigrants and Jews, that we take seriously, as well we should. And yet somehow when the jihadist says it, or when the Hamas charter says it, or when the Ayatollahs who run the Islamic Republic of Iran say it, somehow that's waved off as political grievance and not intent to cause tremendous violence or genocide. Those two things are not compatible. Either you believe people when they say what they want, or you don't.
Yeah. I think we should have a brief sidebar conversation on this topic, because I think that there's one other strand here, which I find genuinely confusing, and I still don't know how to differentiate this from what we're now talking about. But there does seem to be a species of assertion, and even the writing of manifestos in the white supremacist space, which seems like it's not as straightforward as that. I mean, you have this emergence of troll culture on 4chan and 8chan, and you have these, incel lunatics who are circulating what are taken at face value as white supremacist memes. They'll circulate Holocaust images or, lynching images, and they seem to they're
try and dress it up as irony or a joke.
yeah, but in many cases, it really is just a kind of derangement or the most extreme expression of troll culture or shit posting, or I mean, they're just trying to get a rise out of the normies. It's genuinely hard to see where that stops and real, in this case, white supremacist ideology begins. And there may be some Muslim variant of this. I don't know. I mean, there may be people who were categorized as aspiring ISIS followers, but who are really just in this land of nihilism, and it's just like the emergence of Thanatos on the internet, where you have people who are not sincere about anything except they just want to see it all burn, and yet they're trading in the memes of ideological racism or ideological anti-Semitism. And I think it's genuinely confusing when you try to analyze it in the aftermath of a school shooting or a synagogue attack or Christchurch or any of these other episodes.
Aren't those cases the ones that are actually clear? Like when the Christchurch gunman says, spends tons of time on social media posting these ironic memes and then says, I think he said literally, it's time to make a real life effort post, and then he goes out and murders 52 people. Isn't it then clear that the irony is dressing up what is actually just the same disgusting hate?
Yeah, well, in that case, it might be clear, but in some other cases, it might not. I think it was in the case of Christchurch, he said something like he was radicalized by Candace Owens, right? So that on some level, these are not sincere statements of propaganda. I mean, there's a kind of
I get what you're saying.
It is, we're kind of living in the Batman universe, and there is just the fact that there's some number of people who just want to become famous and to commit suicide by cop, like a school shooting. There's the typology of the kind of person who just goes to their school to kill their classmates, and they may even, I mean, like in the case of Columbine, you had Eric Harris, one of the Columbine killers, who in his journal, I think there was a lot of white supremacist stuff in his journal, but this was not an intelligible act of white supremacy. This is just the murder of children, right, by somebody who was deeply disturbed. And yet, if we'd spent a lot of time analyzing his journal, I think it would be possible to try to connect the dots in a white supremacist vein. And it's just, I mean, perhaps there's not much to read into this, but I do think that there are cases where the straightforward reading of here's more hate and its consequences doesn't run through in quite the same way.
Yeah. I guess I'll just say, like, when I see my face on many of these white supremacist forums, and there is, a Pepe the Frog on me, or the most recent one I saw was, the yellow star that the Nazis used to mark the Jews on my forehead. Yeah, maybe the person who put that up intended it as an ironic joke, but I'm certainly not seeing it that way. I'm seeing it as a threat.
Yeah.
So what I'd say is, like, I don't know, and there are experts, I'm sure. There are many experts, many books that are coming out about this. My feeling is, like, err on the side of treating the irony deadly seriously. It's obviously a different, like, I acknowledge, though, what you're saying, though, which is it's a different beast, and it's not as coherent, maybe, as jihadist ideology.
It's different in the sense that, and it does kind of link up with the Trump phenomenon for me. It's just like, like Trump is somebody who is impressively lacking in ideology, right? I mean, he's just chaos. I mean, it's like the chaos of narcissism and selfishness and ignorance. A personality cult has formed around him, and I mean, to some degree, it's gaining energy from the opportunism and cowardice of normal Republicans who do have an ideology, but there is a just a spirit of, for lack of a better word, trolling that is animating this. Like, it's just like, let's just own the libtards. That's the goal. Like, as long as Trump is making someone like me tear his hair out, well then that's all that needs to be accomplished. There are no more ideas behind this. Trump could change all of his policy commitments insofar as he has any tomorrow, and he wouldn't lose his support, right? He could
No,
just
no, that's true. I'm thinking about the idea that, a lot of these people basically imagine themselves like Heath Ledger and the Joker. But Heath Ledger and the Joker still kills a ton of people.
right.
And like, I'd read the manifesto of the killer in Poway. And in a certain sense, it's, a mishmash poo-poo platter of anti-Semitism. Sounds like he came from a family, reading what his parents said after the attack was heartbreaking. It's like, we don't know where our child got these ideas. Did it start off ironic and become real? I don't know. I don't really care when I'm sitting with the daughter of Lori Gilbert Kay, who was murdered there. I guess it's not as interesting to me.
Yeah, well, I guess it just has to be, if it's yet another variable, we have to understand it. I mean, obviously ideas have consequences, and we're taking ideas seriously here, in this case, anti-Semitic ideas, but, racist ideology has consequences, and, any other form of tribalistic intolerance has consequences when it's, sincerely expressed and sincerely believed. And I just worry that there is another thing going on, which is, nihilistic, burn it all down chaos that is, in some cases, proving itself to be indistinguishable from sincerely held beliefs, right? And that's, again, I'm just expressing my confusion more than anything else here. So back to Israel and her enemies.
Yes.
So this is the problem. Israel is in a very dangerous neighborhood, and I think the aspirations of the Arab states who attacked Israel in 48 were probably genocidal.
They were annihilationists.
Yeah, so it's like, what would have happened had Israel lost? It would not have been the mirror image of what happens when Israel wins, right? And yet the left can't seem to do that moral arithmetic anymore, if it ever could. And so Israel is criticized. Israel's been described as the Jew among nations. I don't know who came up with that analogy, but it does seem apt. Israel, for all her flaws, and she certainly has flaws, and Benjamin Netanyahu may be chief among them at the moment, but Israel is held to a different standard at the UN and in any other place where people are trying to weigh the actions of these countries in the balance. What's your view of Israel's PR problem now?
And by the way, it's hilariously unwinnable. I mean, when you try and make the simple point that if I want to walk around in the Middle East right now wearing a tank top and shorts, there's one place where I can do that. And then you make that very basic point, which is like, where would you want to live as a liberal in the Middle East right now? It's like not even a question, right?
You think you can even sharpen it up? Where would you want to live as a liberal Muslim in the Middle East right now?
Exactly. And yet you make that point and you're accused of pinkwashing, right? The idea that like you're using, Israel's great record on gay rights and women's rights and, socialized medicine and all the rest in order to sort of whitewash its original sin, which is, in my view, existing at all, is what they really have a problem with.
Yeah.
This is the thing. I really believe that, and I think that if Bibi doesn't form a government and Benny Gantz becomes prime minister, this will become increasingly clear, because hopefully Benny Gantz will become prime minister, and there will be a government that does not indulge in the kind of vile Arab race baiting that Bibi engages in. Hopefully we will have a prime minister in Israel that, is more concerned about the relationship between Israel and diaspora Jewry. It doesn't give all of the power over religious spaces in public life to the ultra-Orthodox. Hopefully all that will change. But fundamentally what's not going to change is Israel's place in its neighborhood, where, the judgment that most Israelis make about